I think we are ready to begin our time. And I mentioned earlier we have Andrew Kern with us from Circe Institute. He had been with us several years ago. I think we might have been up to third grade at that point. And our school has grown, and his work through Circe has grown nationally. And we are just privileged to have him back with us today for these next 2 days. I love that about the classical Christian movement, as you get to know friends from across the country and get to have the opportunity to continue to learn and grow and build relationship. So please welcome Andrew Kern.
I want to thank Mrs. Salazar because she made traveling out here very easy. And thanks to Liz and to the whole school for welcoming me and paying attention to most of what I said yesterday. Had a great time. And I'm excited for your school here. And I'm excited to meet more of you from other schools. And I got to meet Josh this morning. I'm glad you're feeling better. And I'm also very grateful to you for letting me borrow your Odyssey. So thank you to all of you. I should mention, you're probably wondering why on earth I'm in California wearing a bow tie. So I'll tell you there are 3 reasons for it. The first reason is because I'm going through a midlife crisis. And I've been tying ties. I mean, I was probably no older than 25 when I learned that. And so I'm kind of sick of ties. And I finally learned how to tie a bow tie last week or 2, so I'm all excited by that. So it's kind of a new domain of being for me. More importantly, though, Liz mentioned that we're supposed to be casual this week, or at least that we could be, so I thought, well, good, I'm not going to wear a tie then. Okay. And the third reason is because I was told, I used to live in Boise, Idaho, and I was told when I was up there by an attorney that you generally speaking, if you're wearing a bow tie, people trust you like 20% less. And I thought, you want stereo? And I thought, well, that's good, because one thing you don't want to do is trust a speaker too much. Examine what he's saying, test what's being said. Now, last night, as I was getting ready for, 2 days ago, as I was ready to come here, I decided I wouldn't bring my copy of the Odyssey, even though I'm going to read from it, because it's a big, heavy book and it's too fat. So I got to the hotel and I was looking around for books, and I found a copy of the Bible. And I found a copy of the Book of Mormon. I'm staying at the courtyard, and I thought, okay, there's the Judeo-Christian religion, and there's the American religion. You would expect that they would also have the Odyssey. I looked all over my hotel room, and I could not find any translation. I couldn't get the NIV version. I couldn't get the King James. I couldn't find any copy of the Odyssey. So I ended up having to use the iPad version. And I hope you don't mind that too much, but I do have also a copy, thanks to Josh, of Fagel's. And so I'll be reading from multiple translations and different verses and so on as we go through the Odyssey today. I want in this, I know some of you are getting the creeps. What are you talking about? It's a joke, okay? There is no NIV of the... Hey, Grant, what's your favorite print translation of Paradise Lost?
Stop it.
Okay. Is there an NIV of Paradise Lost? New English version? Okay, I would stop turning around to drink that, but this is angled and I don't want to spill it on myself. It won't be. Okay, I wanted it here so that you wouldn't... See, they're filming this to bribe me, and I don't want the... My desire in this session, such as it is, and in the session to end today, is to talk about weaving. The weaving of wisdom and the wisdom of weaving. In this talk, I want to talk about the wisdom of weaving, and that might sound a little odd to you, so I should explain myself. No, I'm not going to. I'm just going to spend the whole time doing that. But I want to talk about, particularly in this session, weaving in literature. The trouble with that is, in order to talk about weaving in literature, we have to have some sense of what weaving is itself. And I really don't know very much about weaving, but I know that there's a long, long tradition of weaving. It goes back to the very beginnings of the human race, in fact. the craft of weaving, the tools for weaving are rather simple and used in every culture. And because of that, they're very important. So the reason I want to talk about it from literature, even though you might be thinking to yourself, what on earth does this have? We're teachers, why are you talking about weaving? I want to talk about it in literature, particularly in the Odyssey, because it is a ubiquitous theme, a ubiquitous motif rather, in every literature in the world. It's in the Bible, woven throughout. It's woven throughout the Odyssey and the Iliad. Somebody mentioned yesterday that Lucretia in Roman history was notorious, or was famous for her weaving. And so weaving is a big deal. And I want to get at a little bit of why that is. And I want to get at a simple point. There's one thing that I want to try to communicate today in this session and in the session at the end of the day. And that is that weaving is the pattern of thought that works. Okay, that weaving is the divine motif, if I can put it that way, for the created order. And I'll get into that over the course of the whole day, but that's basically what I want to get at. If we want to think well, we need to think as weavers. Now, you might be thinking at this point, what the heck are you talking about? That's why I've got 2 sessions. But I will say this much more right now. The difference between, the opposite of weaving, I would suggest to you, is experimentation. Okay, if you're weaving, you begin with the design in mind, you begin with a pattern in mind, you begin with a process in mind, you know how you're going to get it done, and you create something. If you're experimenting, you've got a question in mind, and you use experiments to test your question, and you don't know what's going to come of it. And that's the difference between believing that the world, the universe that we live in is a creation versus an ongoing self-perpetuating experiment. And the shift there cannot be exaggerated, the significance of that shift. Until around the 16th century, although there were movements in the 13th and 14th century, anybody who thought about being, anybody who thought about existence, except for a few Greek philosophers, regarded the world that we live in as an object of a creator. It was something made. In fact, in the Greek Old Testament, in the Septuagint, when it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, the word that it uses for God making is poeta, the Greek word poeta, from which we get poet. The cosmos is the creation of God. It is the poem of God. In other words, he knew what he wanted to say. We just sang about it, didn't we? I'm tempted to ask you to put up the lyrics again for the Joyful, Joyful song. But did you notice there's who was singing it? Help me on the verse where it's the birds and stuff, the mountains and rivers and all that. There it is, right there. No, that's not it. There it is. All thy works with joy surround thee. You can't hear me if I do that, can you? Am I allowed to do this? I told you there'd be another change. Adaptability, you see. All thy works with joy surround thee. Earth and heaven reflect thy rays. Stars and angels sing around thee, center of unbroken praise. Now that's mostly, the last part anyway, that's up in heaven, right? The angels singing around the throne. Think Isaiah 6. Think the book of Revelation. There's all the angels. But if we go on, can we get? Field and forest. When you are walking through a forest, is it difficult for you to acknowledge, to enjoy the song the forest is singing? Is when you're walking through a field, can you hear it singing? Vale and mountain, flowery meadow, flashing sea, good line there. Chanting bird and flowing fountain, call us to rejoice in thee. I was thinking driving over here along, I love that parkway there. What's it called? Anyway, that road I took to get here. This is California, so there's rolling hills everywhere, right? And beside the road, I'm thinking to myself, the psalm came to my mind, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. You see, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Look at the Psalms. It's all about the heavens and the earth declaring the glory of God, but also calling us to rejoice. To rejoice in him. Why? Because he put it there. Because he put it there on purpose. Because he put it there by design. Because it's a tapestry. It's a weaving. It's a fabric that a poet put together. And well, all right, I'm done now. You can go. But what I want to now belabor is the fact that that's the world we live in. It is a tapestry that has a designer that is always calling us to rejoice in him. So I want to talk about weaving in literature, in particular in the Odyssey, just because that's where I'm spending most of my time these days. And then also we'll talk about weaving in the Bible. But to get there, we need to talk a little bit about the craft of weaving. So let me read to you from Proverbs 31, and then I want to read to you something from the Odyssey, and then we'll talk about the craft of weaving. And I understand that some of you might be furiously taking notes, and I won't tell you don't do that, but I will tell you it won't help. If you want to be thinking about what I'm talking about, I find it hard to know what's coming next myself. So you might want to just follow along and then write a word every now and again. And then if you have a question, I'm going to try my hardest to stop myself before it's too late, and then have some time for you to ask some questions. This thing's fun. It's like a prop, right? You need a prop. So I want to read to you right now from Proverbs 31. Now, you all know, I think, that, well, I shouldn't say that. That's a mean thing to say. I'm going to wager that it's fairly well known that Proverbs 31 is about the virtuous woman. A virtuous woman who can find, says the proverb, the author. And I want to just suggest to you something a little broader in context. It's not that in Proverbs 31, finally Solomon decides, I think I'll describe a virtuous woman. He's been doing that for the whole book. He's given us, throughout the book of Proverbs, he's been presenting to us two women. On the one hand is this wise woman, that is wisdom herself, whose riches are above rubies, who stands at the top of the way and cries out, "Oh, you simple ones, listen to me." And throughout the whole book of Proverbs, we have this woman who is wisdom, who is calling out to us. And on the other hand, you have another woman who is the harlot, who is the adulteress, who is the seductress. And what's astonishing when you read the book of Proverbs that way is how very similar they are. It's amazing how many of the same things they do. And that's done by design, because Solomon was pretty clever. And he was trying to get us to realize how similarly folly appeals to us, but draws us on the path to death, on the path to hell. And I think one of the mistakes we made when we read Proverbs is we look at those passages where the harlot is speaking as just a woman who's trying to seduce a man. It is that, but it's also a voice within you that is trying to destroy you. Maybe it's demonic, maybe it's your own appetitive impulses, maybe it's your own appetites, maybe it's your own passions. It's probably all of that. It's folly. And it's trying to draw you. It's trying to destroy you. And you want to follow her. On the other hand, there's another voice, which is, I would suggest, the voice inspired by the very Spirit of God himself, always wooing us, always drawing us. Very, very different in the end to the voice of folly. And when we get to Proverbs 31, we have two magnificent things going on. One is we have something that women can look at and say, that's what I want to be like. And another, we have something that all of us can look at and say, that's the voice I want to hear. That's the voice I want to hear. So let me read to you the voice that I think we would all be better off listening to. And I'll start at verse 10, which is where Solomon asks the question, who can find a virtuous wife? This is in the Gideon translation. Who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts her. I like that safely added in there, right? Because we trust the harlot too. We trust the woman who leads us astray, but not safely. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and willingly works with her hands. I'll just mention that that's the beginning of the weaving element of this passage that is woven into it. She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. She also rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and a portion for her maidservants. She considers a field and buys it. From her profits, she plants a vineyard. She's quite the stay-at-home mom, right? She girds herself with strength and strengthens her arms. She perceives, I love this, she perceives that her merchandise is good. And by the way, she's right. And her lamp does not go out by night. She stretches out her hands to the distaff, and her hand holds the spindle. Hold on to that image. She stretches out her hands to the distaff, and her hand holds the spindle. She extends her hands to the poor. Yes, she reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household is clothed with scarlet. She makes tapestry for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them and supplies sashes for the merchants. Strength and honor are her clothing. She shall rejoice in time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. She watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is passing. But a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. I call that a lofty dream. I love the fact that the very last verse of Proverbs is saying that. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. Jesus tells us that wisdom is vindicated of her children. Wisdom is vindicated of her children. It's another way of saying, let her own works praise her in the gates. Now I have to pause. There is a passage that says here, her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. And I have to pause and say that my 29th anniversary to Kern is on Sunday. And I'm going to take just this moment and call her blessed. Sometimes I feel like this passage is describing her. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. I cannot tell you how many times the folly of my own mind was overruled by her wisdom, and how many times the unkindness of my own tongue was overruled by the law of kindness on her tongue. So I do have to say to Karen, thank you. I love you, and my heart safely trusts you. Now, back to the point. You notice that part of who she is, part of what she does, is that she weaves. She spins and she weaves. I said to hold on to an image. In verse 19 it says, she stretches out her hands to the distaff, and her hand holds the spindle. There was a time when every single living human being knew what that meant by the time they were a year and a half old. Raise your hand if you know what a distaff is. Raise your hand if you know what a spindle is. Now, this might seem really pointless, what I'm about to say, but I'm going to go right out and say this. The fact that even in this audience, so few of us know what a distaff and a spindle is, and I'll just tell you that I had to look it up, is one of the clearest evidences that we are not a civilized people. I'm going to have to defend that point, I know. Too bad, I'm not right now. Let me read to you from the Odyssey now. The Odyssey is, without any controversy, one of the 4 or 5 greatest books ever written, maybe outside of the Bible, the greatest book ever written. I think it was Glenn Arbery in his book on literature and why it matters. He said, of all the poets, apart from, I think he said, maybe David, God loves Homer best. And I think he's probably right. There is so much going on in the Odyssey that you have to read it a lot to even begin to skim the surface of its beauties. But the first time you read it, you can do that. Now, because, oh yeah, does anybody here, I mentioned this, I was at the hotel and I couldn't find, I mean, go figure. Next time I go anywhere, I'm staying in a Greek hotel. Does anybody here have a copy of Lattimore's translation? I have Fagel's here, and I actually have Lattimore in my thing here. But in Lattimore, I know exactly where it is, everything on the page, and so I'm going to need your forgiveness while I look for a moment. And what I'm going to be looking for here is something on the island of Scheria. The island of Scheria is where the Phaeacians live. I bet that helped you, didn't it? The Phaeacians lived on the island of Scheria, and this is basically a utopia. There's no such place. Okay, and Odysseus probably is making it up. Sorry, Homer obviously is making it up. Odysseus isn't the one who describes it. It's on the island of Scheria, where the Phaeacians live, that he tells his own journey that we call the Odyssey proper. He tells about these 12 adventures that he has, including Polyphemus and Circe and all that stuff. While he's there, he looks a lot. He gazes on things. And I've come to the conclusion, and it's tentative, I'll grant you, but I've come to this tentative conclusion that the reason Homer is such a great poet is because he has one gift beyond all others. It's the gift of admiration. Homer is able to look at something, and I'm going to talk about this tomorrow quite a bit in my talk, You Become What You Behold. But Homer is able to look on things and see the beauties of them and to see the wonders of them basically just by looking. He doesn't sit there trying to get a practical application. He doesn't sit there trying to make use of things. He's no pragmatist. He's an admirer. As Christians, we might say he's a worshiper. He's got this gift for seeing how great something is, and because of that, he puts admiration into some of his main characters. For example, when Hermes crosses the sea to get to the island of Calypso, where Odysseus is hidden at the beginning of the Odyssey, he gets to the island of Ogygia, where Calypso lives. She's a goddess. She's a nymph. She's incredibly beautiful. She's offered Odysseus eternal life if he'll just be her husband, and he says, no, I want to go back to Penelope. But she lives in well, it's a cave, but you know, it's like saying hobbits live in caves. She lives in this incredibly gorgeous island, and she's sitting at her loom, weaving and singing, when Hermes gets there. And when he arrives on the island, he stops on the threshold of her cave and looks around for a page and a half. And then Homer uses that page and a half to describe the island. And of course, if you're looking for thrills and chills and adventure, you're going, come on, get on with the plot, get on with the plot. But that's not what Homer wants to teach us. I don't even want to put it that way. That's not what Homer wants us to experience. What Homer wants us to experience is beauty. And that takes standing still. That takes looking. To quote Moses, that takes acknowledging that we must turn aside and see this great sight. And that's what Hermes does when it's not the same great sight, but that's what Hermes does when he arrives at the cave. He stops, and for a page and a half he sees the beauty of it. And the same thing happens when Odysseus gets to the island of Scheria and comes to the palace of the king. And I'm going to read to you, I'm not going to read to you too much of it now because I'm going to read to you more of it tomorrow, but I want to read enough of it that you get the point. There were walls plated in bronze, crowned with a circling frieze glazed as blue as lapis. Ran to left and right from outer gates to the deepest court recess. And solid golden doors enclosed the palace. It's kind of like here. Up from the bronze threshold, silver doorposts rose, with silver lintel above, and golden handles too. And dogs of gold and silver were stationed either side, forged by the god of fire with all his cunning craft, to keep watch on generous King Alcinous' palace. These dogs of gold and silver actually were, we'd maybe call them robots. They're able to do things. His immortal guard dogs, ageless all their days. Inside, to left and right in a long unbroken row from farthest outer gate to the inmost chamber, thrones stood backed against the wall, each draped with a finely spun brocade. Now, note that. Each draped with a finely spun brocade. And this is the most important part that I want you to hear about from this passage. Women's handsome work. Here, the Phaeacian lords would sit enthroned, dining, drinking. The feast flowed on forever. And young boys molded of gold, set on pedestals standing firm, were lifting torches high in their hands to flare through the nights and light the feasters down the hall. Now, as an aside, my understanding is that this is what Nero was basing his torture of the Christians on. You know, these gold and silver men holding torches up, he would pour wax on the Christians and light them, and they would be his candles for his feasts. They found it worth the reward. And Alcinous has some 50 serving women in his house, some turning the hand mill, grind the apple yellow grain. Some weave at their webs, or sit and spin their yarn, fingers flickering quick as aspen leaves in the wind, and the densely woven woolens dripping oil droplets. Just as Phaeacian men excel the world at sailing, driving their swift ships on the open seas, so the women excel at all the arts of weaving. That is Athena's gift to them, beyond all others, a genius for lovely work and a fine mind, too. I want to read the Lattimore translation, if I may, of that last little bit. We're in book 7, and I'm not on here. I'm sorry, I'm going to get better at moving this around. It won't benefit you any, but I will get better. The heart pondered much in Odysseus as he stood before coming to the bronze threshold. Please accept my apologies. I should have had this ready, but I didn't expect this to happen. There are those who weave the webs and who turn the distaffs. Never is the fruit spoiled. I jumped. Okay, here it goes. The women are skilled in weaving and dowered with wisdom bestowed by Athene. To be expert in beautiful work, thank you. To be expert in beautiful work, to have good character. To be expert in beautiful work, to have good character. One of the themes of Greek thought, a genius for lovely work and a fine mind too, is that those two things are intimately bound together. That in order to have a genius for lovely work, you have to have a fine mind. That in order to be expert in beautiful work, you have to have good character. That in fact, the goal of life, I think it was Isocrates put it this way, never stop sculpting yourself. In a way the opposite of weaving, and yet in a way the same thing. In other words, you are your own work of art. If you're going to be a man of good character or a woman of great virtue, if you're going to be a beautiful souled person, then you need to be skilled in weaving, endowed with wisdom bestowed by Athene. Well, metaphorically. You need to be expert in beautiful work to have good character. And the Greek notion was that without the arts, all of which are rooted in weaving, without the arts, we don't think right. We don't perceive reality correctly. It's not that you have your STEM subjects or your core subjects or whatever you want to call the main thing that everybody needs to study, and then those few gifted people also need to do music or singing or weaving or whatever it happens to be. Painting, dancing. No. The arts come first. Because by learning the arts, we order our soul to reality. Let me say that again. Let me rephrase it. By learning to think artistically, we order our soul to reality. Why? Because reality is not an experiment. It is a creation. And we are the image of a creator. Forgive me if you're a scientist, and don't misunderstand me, but we are the image of a creator, not a scientist. We are the image of one who thinks in analogies. We are the image of one who thinks in likenesses. We are the image of one who is constantly making beautiful things, not one who is constantly trying to figure out what is true. Now, please do not misunderstand me. Nothing I have said is meant to be opposed to science. In fact, I love the sciences. I love the sciences so much that I want them exalted to their rightful place. But right now, the sciences have exalted themselves beyond their rightful place. The sciences have exalted themselves to the throne of God, which means they've become nothing. I mean, studies philosophy of science in the late 20th century, even in the 19th century in Europe. 19th century in Europe. The basic idea of science is that you no longer can know anything. Scientia, Latin word for knowledge. Do you know they only started calling the natural sciences science in the 17th century? You know what they called it before that? It's fascinating. Natural philosophy. They started to call it science because in the 17th and 18th century, a very small group of people, disciples of Francis Bacon, decided that they were the only ones who could gain knowledge. That there's only one kind of knowledge, and that is the knowledge that you can gain through experimentation, combined with rational, Cartesian reason. And so therefore, we are the scientists, they said. Does that affect our culture? Do you think that affects our culture? If you're going to speak in public, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good to quote Homer, is it? Not if you're trying to get to the point where we actually make a decision. Now, you can move people quoting Homer, but you can't guide people. You can't, or the Bible, obviously, right? You can misquote the Bible all you want. I will never forget Bill Clinton's, was it his DNC speech? No, it was the Democratic National Convention in 1992. I listened to his speech, and when he was done, I said he just won the election. But the thing that struck me the most in the whole speech was when he said this: "The eye has not seen, and the ear has not heard what we can do." Actually, he said it this way: "As the scriptures tell us, the eye has not seen," right? So you can misquote the Bible to your advantage all you want, but to actually subject yourself to it would be absurd. Because the modern world, the modern mind believes that it is a fundamental mistake to trust somebody else's authority. It is a fundamental mistake to ever subordinate or subject yourself to a person who is wiser than you. You have to discover it for yourself. And if you'd like to see the consequences of that, I offer you our country. I offer you the suicide rate. I offer you the number of 13-year-old girls cutting themselves. I offer you the number of abortions that we perform in our country. I offer you, what's his name, Gosling? I offer you the madness of our culture. That's what scientific experimentation is, the ultimate source of knowledge, which is to say, you exalted to the only source of sheer knowledge for yourself. That's what it will get you. To begin with doubt is to commit intellectual suicide. To begin with doubt is to isolate yourself. That's what Descartes did. That's how he gave birth, they say, to the modern mind. He said, I resolve to begin with doubt. We acknowledge that whatever is not of faith is sin, right? Now, Descartes was doing a mental experiment, but since then, that's not what they've taken it for. Since then, we've embraced that as a dogma. Doubt everything, question everything. Self-defeating, of course, but that's what our culture does. It defeats itself. Wisdom, on the other hand, gives you a heart, gives you a trust that you can hold to safely. But wisdom is not something that we can gain on our own. Wisdom is something that we receive as a gift. We receive it through those who are wiser than us, especially through God himself. And he gives us teachers, and he gives us gifts, and he gives us a body, and he weaves it all together in this magnificent tapestry. You want wisdom? Look at this book. Even in a horrible translation, this book is full of wisdom. This is Gideon's translation. So when we come to a passage like this, that is, the women excel at all the arts of weaving. That is Athena's gift to them beyond all others. A genius for lovely work and a fine mind too. It's the same thing. You are an artist. You were born to be an artist. You are the image of an artist. You will never be happy. You will never be happy unless you are good at art. In some way, you will never be happy because it is, sorry, this is an accident, because it is woven into your soul. You are the image of a creator, and unless you are creating successfully, you cannot be happy. I love this book called The Self by, I think it's Paul Vitz. And the first chapter is called The Mimetic Self. And on the bottom of the first page is a line quoting René Girard from Stanford, who said, "What can you say of a being who is created to be the image of another? Surely this, that he can never be fully, I think fulfilled. He can never be fulfilled unless he is like another." Think about that. Fundamental to who we are as human beings is the need to be like others. And the more you try to be like yourself and nobody else, the more you destroy yourself. You were not made to be like yourself. You were made to be like another. And because we have a broken tapestry, because the tapestry is torn, because the image on that tapestry is stained, we now are in a perpetual state of frustration because we can't recapture that image. And so we look around and we find any image we can that we like, and we say, that's what I want to be like. If I'm a basketball player, I'm looking at LeBron James. If I'm a dancer, well, in that case, I'd look at my daughter, Larissa, who's a ballerina, and I'd think, well, wish I could do that. If I'm a painter, I'm going to look at Michelangelo or Da Vinci or Jackson Pollock. No, just kidding. I'm going to look at some painter and I'm going to say, that's what I wish I could do. That's what I want to be like. If I want to become good at anything, the only way I can become good at anything is by looking at somebody else's work who's good at it and imitate. We're born imitators. There's never a time when we're not imitating. You know why you speak English? Because you're a cheap imitator, that's why. Go make up your own language. Tolkien did it. Do you see how bound we are to being like another? And that other that is our satisfaction, that is our joy. That other that we want to be like in the deepest recesses of the deepest pockets of our deepest heart is Christ himself. who is the full incarnation, the full revelation, the apocalypse, which literally means revelation. The revelation of God himself, in whose image we have been made. And if we learn to think like artists, if we learn to think like creators, then we can understand the reality that we are placed into. This is why the Greeks had a 75-year period of unparalleled creativity in the history of the world. This is why, from the time they defeated the Persians until they committed suicide in the Peloponnesian War, they created poetry and sculpture and temples and architecture and plays such as the world has never since seen in that short a period of time. Because having conquered the Persians, they had such a sense of their own dignity. They had such a sense of the worth of the human spirit and the value of freedom that they poured it out into their arts. And they regarded themselves as creators. And they made all kinds of mistakes. Would that we could make such bad mistakes, right? Now, were they Christians? Of course not. Of course not. But somehow, and maybe it was through the Jewish communities in Alexandria, maybe it was because due to the idolatry of the Jews, God had to find another people. But somehow, here was this one group of people. Think of this. One group of people in the entire ancient world who believed that the world was real and knowable. Let that sink in for a moment. The Babylonians didn't believe the world was real and knowable. The Egyptians, if you're an Egyptian, you look at the Nile River, what is it? It's a god. If it's a god, what isn't it? It's not a river. It's not a river. You can't go to the river and say, oh, look, a river. I'll go swimming in it. I can trust it. No, you can't. The Nile River was a source of life and death to the Egyptians. They gave everything they had to try to appease that river. Until one day, somewhere around 4,000 or 5,000 BC, some man figured out how to regulate the river. If you defeat a god, what are you? You're a god. That's the foundation of the pharaonic. Is that how you say it? The pharaonic, the pharaoh. And his role as priest. They worshiped the pharaoh as a god. And by the way, he worshipped himself as a god. To the Cleopatra. Cleopatra believed herself to be a divine being. So did Julius Caesar, for that matter, descendant of Venus. The pharaoh got his power by defeating a god. The hippopotamus, is it a hippopotamus? No, it's a god. If you believe that all these things are gods, then you don't believe they're what they are. But somehow, for some reason, among the Greeks, were a few people at least, who said, no, that hippopotamus is a hippopotamus. And that tree is a tree. And because that tree is a tree, I can know it. That's the foundation of Western culture. That idea, that the knowability of the world is the foundation of Western civilization. And we only can know this world when we realize that it is a gorgeous work of art. But our culture for 400 years now has been doing away with that notion and studying it as though it is an ongoing self-perpetuating experiment. Now, something along this line that's important is that sometimes we think that Darwin did a scientific revolution. Actually, we usually think that Darwin accomplished a scientific revolution. He didn't. The scientific revolution that Darwin accomplished was accomplished by René Descartes when he laid the logic of modern thought. And basically what he said was, if I'm going to understand something complex, I have to see it in its simplest form and see how it moved from the simple to the complex. This is a very useful mental activity. It doesn't necessarily correspond to reality, it just works. It works logically. If I want to see how did this car get to be such a complex thing now, I can go back over the history of time and say, okay, it used to be a lot simpler. And you could reverse engineer it, right? You could figure out backwards how something very complex became like it is. René Descartes laid that out as the mode of knowing the world we live in. And John Dewey explicitly points out that that's when Darwin became inevitable. So Darwin did not accomplish a scientific revolution. He secured a philosophical revolution. He incorporated, or he encouraged, or he pinned down, let's put it that way, he pinned into place a mindset that John Dewey described two ways. He said he gave us a new intellectual temper, and he gave us a new intellectual, what was the other word? It was an intellectual revolt. It was an intellectual revolt that introduced a new intellectual temper. Now, I'm quoting Dewey from his essay on the impact of Darwinism upon philosophy. It's about 12 pages long in a Word document. You can get it for free online. Can't recommend it highly enough. If you want to understand the foundational principles of modern thought, they're all there. They're all there. And the basic way that I would, it's hard to understand because Dewey wrote it, but the basic way I would summarize it is this. The human mind has no connection to anything outside of it. So let's build a school system accordingly. You can't know anything, so let's base our education on that. If it's an intellectual revolt, as Dewey said, if Darwin introduced an intellectual revolt, what was it a revolt against? Dewey explains. It was an intellectual revolt against the idea that there are species, that there are kinds of things. On the Origin of Species, right? That's the name of the book. On the Origin of Species. Intriguingly, he calls his next book The Descent of Man, aptly titled. On the Origin of Species argues that we have now proved that there is no eternity to kinds, that things change, that there is nothing about humans that is permanent. There's nothing about trees that is permanent. There's nothing about bugs that is permanent. There are no threads in this tapestry that can be known for what they are. Okay? Every thread is going to change color on you. The problem with that is extremely practical. If there is no such thing as an eternal kind, and I know that there was a beginning for man because God spoke them into being, but if there's no such thing as a kind, as humankind, as mankind, to use the term from Genesis 1, then man can't be known. There's nothing to know. All there is, says Dewey, is perpetual, permanent, unending change. Flux, as some of the Greek philosophers called it. All there is flux. And see, this is my problem. Here I'm going to, can I weave a new thread into this? This is my problem with conventional Christian education. And here I need you to be very patient with me because I don't want to come across as knowing what I'm talking about. I don't want to come across as big brother-ish from the parable of the prodigal son. I don't want to come across as let's just say self-righteous. I don't want to come across as all wise or something. But I have to offer to you a criticism for conventional Christian education. We'll have Ken Ham come into our communities and do a big old talk about the evils of Darwinism. And he'll say, all of Christian culture, or not, I don't think he uses that term, but he'll say all of culture, thought, everything is ruined by this. And all the Christians go, yeah. And then they'll go back to their schools and they will continue to use Darwinian modes of instruction, teaching a Darwinian curriculum, using Darwinian modes of assessment, and using Darwinian modes of governance, and adding a Bible class. Do you understand? This is my appeal to you here at this point. Do you understand that the conventional school is completely rooted in its core principles in nihilism, in atheism? That the techniques of teaching, that the basic principles of philosophy, that the modes of assessment, that the theory of knowledge, the epistemology, that the anthropology, the belief about what a human being is. Do you understand that what you learn in a teacher's college today is rooted in nihilism? And that the linchpin of nihilism is the notion that the existence that we are participating in is an accident or, at best, an experiment. This is the ultimate solvent of Christianity. If we accept into our curriculum, our teaching modes, our modes of assessment, and our modes of governance, the principles of atheism, nihilism, and naturalism, and vitalism, and all these other forms of nihilism, we are giving a foothold to Satan. And by the way, yes, I believe in Satan. See, this is what I just said. This is how much my mind is corrupted by modern thinking. I'm embarrassed to say, I'm hesitant to say that if we do all this, we're giving a foothold to Satan. What could be more obvious? We're engaged in a spiritual warfare. We're not wrestling against flesh and blood. We're wrestling against principalities, powers, spiritual forces of wickedness. Seems like we have to take that seriously. Now, mind you, if we do, the world won't take us seriously. And so we're going to have to be fools. We're going to have to be fools. One of the most beautiful and creative works of art I've ever seen is the book of 1 Corinthians. The book of 1 Corinthians is all about aesthetic judgment. Because for Paul, making judgments is an art. The core principle of it is reduced to what he describes as a more excellent way than the one they're using. Okay, than the ones they're using. They're using the flesh, they're using the spirit, the soul, sorry, not the spirit, but the soul. They're using every other standard they can come up with. They probably, if they lived today, they would use all kinds, well, actually, they did use standardized tests. Because in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12, Paul rebukes the false leaders. He says, but they, listen to these words, but they, comparing themselves with themselves and measuring themselves by themselves, are not wise. Right? Obviously, that's standardized testing. They didn't have computers, but what are we doing with those tests? We're comparing ourselves among ourselves, and we are measuring ourselves by ourselves. Why would you do that? Why would you measure yourself by yourself? Or let's say you're in a community. Why would you measure yourself, the quality of your own being, by those around you? Why would you do that? The answer is because you don't have any standards. The answer is because you don't know what you're doing. Okay, that's why a community would come up with radical, arbitrary, relativistic, totally relativistic ways of measuring themselves, because they don't actually know what is the end goal here. What is the goal we're seeking, and what are the steps along the way? Look, if you're a basketball coach, the last thing in the world you're going to do is give your kids a standardized test on basketball, because you know what you're doing. But the less well you know what you're doing, the more you're going to turn toward relativistic standards. But if you know the nature of what you're doing, that's the key word right there. If you know the nature of what you're doing, and you know what this thing is, then you know the milestones, you know the signposts, you know the steps along the way, and you know the standards. And if you can move through those standards, it would be a complete and utter distraction to you to compare yourself with other people. It would be a total evasion of responsibility to measure yourself by how other people are doing. What good does that do? I'm trying to figure it out. I know it helps us get into college if we do well on these tests, so that we can send our kids off to become fornicating unbelievers for 4 years. Oh, sorry, that slipped. But really, what is the what is the good that it does within the nature of what we're doing? Now, don't get me wrong here. I know that we kind of have to do it, right? Parents won't put their kids in our schools until we heal them, unless we give standardized tests and do well on them. Okay, I'm okay with that. I just don't want to give them any attention. The tests, I mean. Right? I mean, if you're teaching a kid classically, he's going to get in the 80s or 90s. Your school's going to do 80s or 90s percentile. You're going to go ahead and take the test, and you're going to say, okay, we got that out of the way. But you're not going to give it any attention. Why would you reduce the human mind to thinking like that? The only reason we would is because we don't know what education is, which is true of our culture. When you don't believe that there's anything to know, when you don't believe that the crucial point here, when you don't believe that there are faculties by which we come to know, then you don't cultivate them. Here's how Dante put it in the Paradiso. Most threatening lines I've ever heard on education. Much worse than uselessly, he leaves the shore, more full of error than he was before, who fishes for the truth, but lacks the art. How many of you would like to know the truth? Nobody's raising, no, I'm just kidding, I know you all do. By nature, we are born by God, created by God, with an inclination and desire to know the truth. Now, we're broken and fallen, I know that. And so when the truth threatens us, we run from it. But there's a delight in knowing that 3 + 2 = 5. There's a delight in figuring out the distributive property and actually perceiving the reality of it. There's a delight in finally coming to understand that first definition in Euclid, a point is that which has no part. It took me 5 years to figure that out. Man, was I happy. There's a delight in actually knowing truth, whether it be mathematical or poetic or whatever. There's a pleasure in knowing truth that transcends any pleasure the body can give us. We, by nature, says Aristotle, desire to know. Now, what that means is, to use Dante's image, by nature we are always fishing for the truth. We are always fishing for the truth. Now let me repeat his poem again, his lines, and think about that fact. We are all always fishing for the truth. Much worse than uselessly he leaves the shore, more full of error than he was before, who fishes for the truth but lacks the art. Two crucial points here. That person is worse than useless. I don't mean to himself. He is in a worse than useless situation. Now, Dante wrote the Paradiso when he was exiled from Florence. He probably was in Ravenna. And if my memory serves, Ravenna is on the Adriatic Sea. And what I imagine is this. Dante, he's a poet. He sits around doing nothing, right? Okay. God give us more people who sit around doing nothing. So Dante gets up one morning, he can't sleep or whatever, it's 4:30 in the morning, he goes down to the sea, he goes down to the Adriatic at the harbor in Ravenna, and there's all these boats. The sun begins to rise, and before sunrise, the fishermen are coming down to the seashore. And they're getting their nets. They've got their nets ready the night before, but they're getting their nets and their boats. They're doing everything they have to do to get their boats ready to go out on the Adriatic. Some of them are going to go out on the Mediterranean, which we know from the Odyssey and the Aeneid is treacherous in points. And he watches, and I imagine that one day he was watching and some kid came down there, and maybe his dad was sick or something. Poor family, they don't have anything to eat, dad's sick, we got to get some fish. And so the kid comes down to the boats and he gets his boat as ready as he can, but he doesn't really know how to fish all that well yet. He doesn't know how to take care of a boat all that well yet. So he gets his boat ready and he goes out on the Adriatic, and Dante watches as he struggles to get the boat under control and he struggles with the nets. Maybe he's too proud, he's young, he's too proud to listen to friends or to some of the elders. And so he's out there on the Adriatic, and Dante wonders, what's going to happen to this guy? Maybe he never comes back. And Dante reflects on truth and how we want to know the truth. He reflects on the inner impulse, the inner drive that God has woven into the fabric of our soul to know the truth. And he thinks, if we don't learn how to fish for it, we're like that boy. We might never come back. It won't be useless. It will be deadly. This is the world that you and I live in today. We live in a world that doesn't believe in knowable truth. And because it doesn't believe in knowable truth, it doesn't teach children how to fish for it. And so the typical 5th grade child, you get in an argument with him and he'll say, that's true for you. And if the Holy Spirit inhabited us the way he ought to, since we are his temple, and if our minds spent any time at all in the Holy of Holies, when we heard a child say to us, that's true for you, our hearts would be so broken for that child that we would fall on our faces in tears. Because what that child has just said to us is, my soul is already ruined. Unless I'm just a parrot repeating things without caring about what I'm saying, if I actually believe what I said, my soul has already been overthrown. I am already in a state of despair. Because that's what it means to say, that's true for you. It means that there is no knowable truth. We Christian classical educators believe that the soul feeds on the truth. That it is the necessity of our soul to simply receive it. I mean, look, again, I used math earlier. Even in math, think about that poor child who doesn't perceive the truth of the distributive property. He's powerless. Give him a more complicated problem, he can't do it. He's broken. And he could conclude, this is impossible. That'd be a little tiny dose of despair. All of us have known despair in math class at one point or another, right? Aside. Sometimes people say, you classical educators are just producing a bunch of proud kids. How do you prevent a child from becoming intellectually proud? My answer to that is give them the next math lesson. Don't let any classically educated child ever rest mathematically, because there's nobody that math won't humble. Math is not something that sits in a box and you get it. Okay, there is no limit. There is no limit to the splendors and beauties of math. And we have not even, as a human species, we have not even begun to touch the wonders of what math has to offer us. There are going to be people in heaven figuring out the next digit in pi forever. And then there's going to be people in hell doing the same thing. Maybe not. But if you learn the distributive property, and I don't mean memorize it, I mean that if your soul perceives the truth of the distributive property, a whole world is open to you, mathematically, a whole world. You can calculate faster, you can, I don't know if you could build bridges just on the distributive property, but you can sure do a lot. It opens up whole new avenues. But what we do is as basic Darwinists, we've reduced math to something that is learned in a tight sequence. Everybody's going to go in the same step. It's industrial. It's industrial. Which brings me back to the point of this talk, by the way. I'll get there in just a second. It's industrial in that everybody's going to learn at the same pace, the same things in the same way. Why? Because you're not actually perceiving a truth. You're remembering a formula. Do you understand the difference? As Christians, we aren't about memorizing formulas, although we do. We're not about it, we do it to use the formulas. But why? So that by meditating, by contemplating on the formula, by thinking about the formula, we can come with our souls to perceive the truth expressed by the formula. And that's circular, not linear. That comes from stopping and dwelling and sitting still, even in math. Same thing happens when you're looking at a poem. You need to look at a poem from 17 different angles. You need to rotate around it. I mean, one of my favorite points C.S. Lewis ever made is in his book, An Experiment in Criticism. He talks about the non-literary reader. The non-literary reader. The first mark of the non-literary reader is he'll say, I read that book. As though that's a reason not to read it again. I'm to the point now at almost 50 where I'm thinking, why would I read a book for the first time anymore? I mean, I guess for amusement. I don't even like watching movies for the first time. One thing I cannot figure out is why would somebody say, I've already seen that movie, I wouldn't want to watch it again. I think what we do is we want to be enslaved, right? The first time we watch a movie, the movie is the master. And we just want it to put a hook through our nose and lead us around. We like that. We like being enslaved. But if you watch a movie 2, 3, 4, 5 times, you start to take control of it. You start to get what's going on. It's the same with books. One of the things we're trying to teach kids how to do with books is to become the master, not the slave. Same with math. Your students should be taking math so that they can become free people. You understand that 4 of the 7 liberal arts are mathematics, right? Arithmetic is a liberal art. First point there is it's an art. The second point is it's liberal. And what that means is it is a faculty that we cultivate so that we can be free people. You cannot have a free society. You cannot have a free community that doesn't have a lot of people in it. Not everybody, but a lot of people in it who can perceive the truth of geometry. Sorry, I keep brushing that. But we have bought into an industrial mode of thinking which is fundamentally rooted in the rejection of the creation. The desire to conquer the creation. The desire to take not authority, not dominion, but tyranny over the creation. You see, if you have dominion over something, then you're like Psalm 1. You bless what you have dominion over. You use what you're a tyrant of. Do you see the difference? If you use your children so that you can get satisfaction out of life or whatever, then you're a tyrant over your children. If you use the students in your class so that you can be recognized as teacher of the year, or you use methods and techniques so that you can do this or that, you're enslaving them. You're a tyrant. But if you walk into the classroom seeking to bless, seeking to weave into their souls the threads and the fabric and the fine linen of the grace of God, then you bless them. And what does it mean to bless? The Greek word for bless, there's 2 Greek words, but one of the Greek words for bless is eulogia. Logos, do you see logos? It means to say something good about. In that sense, we can say something good about God, right? We can bless God. But here's the thing. When God blesses, when God says something good, the thing that he says is never only a symbol like it so often is for us. In God, there's no separation between the sign and the reality. So when God says, bless you, the blessing goes with his word. And we become what he says. When he speaks life to us, we come to life. When he speaks the resurrection power of Christ, we become resurrected people. And to bless, Psalm 1 tells us, is to be like a river, like a tree planted by the rivers of water, bearing fruit in season, becoming exactly what you're supposed to be. And one of the things that you're supposed to be is a knower of the truth. And the only way we can ever come to know the truth is if we learn how to weave. One of the most astonishing events in world history is the Luddites. Anybody here remember the Luddites? Do you know what the Luddites were? I've been really struck by this lately. I've always had a problem with these things. iPads, iPhones, computers. I was reading something by a monk recently complaining about how even the monasteries now you have the internet and email. How can you be alone? A hermit with the internet. That'd be a good name for a band, wouldn't it? Internet Hermits. When the Industrial Revolution happened, it was in England, and steps along the way, that there was a development of the flying shuttle. This happened around the 14th century, as I understand it. And the flying shuttle allowed there's the warp and the weft, and it allowed the weft to go back and forth so fast that people who had been doing the weaving previously, their jobs were at risk. When we get to the 18th century, late 18th and 19th century, they get to the point where one little kid, 12 years old, could run 6 looms all by himself. Think of how much faster you can make clothing when you do that. The Luddites were, maybe there was a guy named Ned Ludd or not, but the Luddites were a group of people who literally went to the factories and smashed the looms. And usually if you read about it, what you'll read is they were afraid of losing their jobs. I don't believe that. I don't think that's all it was. I think that they deeply intuited that if weaving was taken out of the hands of the local community and placed in a factory, civilization itself was at risk. We need to learn to weave. We need to learn to take the tapestry of our being and the tapestry of those around us, and we need to learn the habit, the pattern of weaving. As long as we think of what we're doing as experimenting to see what works, we're admitting we don't know what we're doing. But if we have an end in mind, if we have a design, which is the image of God, and we are laboring to weave every strand given by God into that fabric so that His image appears on the tapestry, then we can grow in wisdom. Then we can make wise decisions. Then we can become like the virtuous woman. Because she doesn't just see what she can get power over. She begins with admiration and worship. And she seeks to take that image that she loves so much and weave it into her family. That is what we're called to do in our classrooms. And this afternoon, in the closing session for today, I'll talk a little bit more about the weaving of wisdom. How do we weave wisdom into our souls, into our families, into our households, and into our classrooms? I think I'm out of time, right? About 10 minutes ago? Am I supposed to stop now? Is there time for Q&A is what I'm wondering.
I think we're actually maybe we can take it in the afternoon.
Okay. All right, I'm done. Thanks. Anybody know who Wilhelmina Stitch is or was? Anybody ever hear that name before? I have no idea who she was, but her name pops up in this paragraph I'm about to read to you, and I thought that might help if somebody could tell me who she is. Anybody ever hear of Hollywood? She's right next to Hollywood, so I think there's some relation. I get the impression from this paragraph that she's the Danielle Steele of the 1940s. So here's the paragraph I want to read to you. It is the business of education to wait upon Pentecost. That's what they teach us in Teachers College. Unhappily, there is something about educational syllabuses, and especially about examination papers, which seems to be rather out of harmony with Pentecostal manifestations. The energy of ideas does not seem to descend into the receptive mind with quite that rush of cloven fire which we ought to expect. Possibly there is something lacking in our idea of education. Possibly something inhibiting has happened to the energy. But Pentecost will happen, whether within or without official education. From some quarter or other, the power will descend, to flame or to smolder until it is ready to issue in a new revelation. We need not suppose that because the mind of the reader is inert to Plato, it will therefore be inert to Nietzsche or Karl Marx. Failing those, it may respond to Wilhelmina Stitch or to Hollywood. No incarnate idea is altogether devoid of power. If the idea is feeble, the energy dispersed, and the power dim, the indwelling spirit will be dim, dispersed, and feeble. But such as it is, so its response will be, and such will be its manifestation in the world. And you're probably thinking, what? That's what I thought when I finished that paragraph too. I wondered, can anybody interpret it for me? Was that Pentecostal tongues? No. This is from a book by Dorothy Sayers called The Mind of the Maker. And if you haven't read this book, I would put it among the, really, as a teacher, as a Christian thinker, I would put this really high up on your priority list. Obviously, there's other books you have on that list, and I won't say, I don't know what they are, so I won't say dump them all. But put this on your list as a book that's important to read. What she's doing in this book is explaining, she is expressing by analogy the power of the Christian creed, the power of the Trinity, the power of thinking about reality in light of the Holy Trinity. She says at the very beginning of the book that what she wants to do is explore the analogies between the truths revealed to us and expressed for us in the creed and the way we think generally, the way we create art and so on. She quotes a Sir Arthur Eddington at the beginning of her second chapter, which is called The Image of God, saying, "It is because the mind, the weaver of illusion, is also the only guarantor of reality, that reality is always to be sought at the base of illusion." Interesting notion there. Reality and illusion in conflict, but underneath all our illusions is a reality. And you can look at the illusions to find the reality. The mind is weaving illusions. Above that, she quotes Thomas Aquinas from the Summa Contra Gentiles, or however you want to say that, saying this: "Those things which are said of God and other things are predicated neither univocally nor equivocally, but analogically. Accordingly, since we arrive at the knowledge of God from other things, the reality of the names predicated of God and other things is first in God according to his mode, but the meaning of the name is in him afterwards." Now, I'm not sure what all that means after the other things part, but the important thing here is that we arrive at the knowledge of God from other things. Right? Would you agree with this, that we cannot look directly on God? That if we're going to think about God, we're going to have to think about other things? Isn't that in fact exactly what the Bible presents to us? A kingdom of heaven already is an analogical term, right? It's a kingdom. Is that a kingdom like an earthly kingdom? Is it the same? Is it different? Well, yes, it's the same and different. It's analogical. It's the kingdom of heaven. And what's heaven? Is it the sky? Is it where the stars are? Or is it some other place? Is even that an analogy for heaven? Yes, it is. It's like it and it's different from it. The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. We talk about the knowledge of God, and when we're going to talk about God, we're going to understand God by thinking about things that God has made. Happily, there's nothing that exists that God hasn't made. And so everything that exists can reveal something to us about God. Now, I know that there's like computers. Did God make computers? Well, that's just a bunch of junk. Sorry, that's just a bunch of stuff that God made that we've sort of reformatted into a new structure. The basic point is, if we're going to know truth, we have to know any truth, any idea. We have to know it by seeing it manifested, by seeing it embodied in something other than the truth itself, because we don't see truth directly. Not in this life. We might in the next life, I'm not sure. But in this life, we see through a glass darkly. I've read some theologians think that angels do perceive truth directly, that they are pure intellects. And so what are we talking about? What does all this mean? Why am I wasting your time on this technical theological language that I don't even understand? I think the first sentence by Sayers that I quoted from Aquinas might help us a little bit. Those things which are said of God and other things are predicated, there's our grammar term, predicated, we have predicates, it means to say about, predicated neither univocally nor equivocally, but analogically. Okay, let's look at those three words. What does it mean to be univocal? The older brother in the prodigal son, he's univocal. Okay, univocal, literally it means one voice, a single voice. A univocal belief about reality is that all there is ultimately is one thing. Parmenides believed that the universe is univocal, that nothing changes, that change itself is an illusion. There's just the one thing. On the other hand, there's equivocal, and that means equal voices, I suppose would be a way to put it. But it's the idea, if we look at words, univocal means a word has one meaning and you can't change it. Equivocal means that a word can mean anything. Which is true? A word has one meaning or a word can mean anything. Well, since it matters what words mean, because one of the things we talk about when we use words is God himself, it matters whether words are univocal or equivocal. And what she argues, and what Thomas Aquinas is arguing here, is that neither one is true. Words are analogical. And what that means is that everything is the same as everything else, and everything is different from everything else at the same time. And so if we're going to know the world we live in, we need to think about it analogically. Now, what does that mean? I'm going to get, this is all, philosophical stuff, but I'm going to try to put it into, I'm going to try to follow out what I'm talking about here by putting it into physical types, images that we can use to think about it. And I probably should have done that first, but then you wouldn't have had any questions, and so what would be the fun? So when we talk about analogical thinking, we're talking about something different from analytical thinking. Analytical means literally to cut up. Ana is basically a Greek prefix that means up. Analogical, as I understand it, means that there is a word that can be transferred. It can be used at its level and it can be used at a higher level. Analytical only functions at the same level. And so if I'm going to study a frog analytically, I'll kill it. And I'll put it on a table, and I will analyze it. I will cut it up. I will dissect it. This is what Wordsworth was getting at when he said in his poem, "The world is too much with us." He said, "We murder to dissect." Now, is there a place for that? Of course. Of course. I wish we did it more with cats than frogs. No, just kidding. Thanks for getting that right away. So there's a cutting up that does give us a certain kind of knowledge, right? It does give us a certain kind of knowledge. But do you really know a frog if you cut up its carcass? Absolutely not. You've learned about a frog's carcass. And you can look at that carcass very closely and learn, if you have a very highly specialized knowledge of what carcasses can tell you and organs and so on, you can look at a frog's dead carcass and learn a lot about frogs. But if you don't watch them play by the pond, you haven't got to know them. Do you see the difference? You can learn about something when it's dead, but you can't come to know that thing unless it's alive, unless you have a relationship with it. And when we talk about truths, what we typically do is we study them dead. Math books do this to truths all the time. Science books do this. History books do this notoriously. Oh my goodness. I cannot fathom how somebody could hate history so much that they could write a chapter about a period in history and then predetermine the questions that the student will ask and actually list those questions and insist that the student answer those questions because they thought those questions were important when they published the book. I cannot fathom how somebody could hate a child and hate history so much that they would do that to either of them. That's dead. That's dead history. Now you could use such a book and as they say, bring it to life. I always, when I read these things like history comes alive or the Bible comes alive, who killed them? We don't have to bring these things to life. We just have to let them live, you see. And if we're going to study something living, then we can't kill it and cut it up and dissect it and expect our children to love it. This is, I hope you'll all forgive me for this grisly metaphor I'm about to give you, but this is what I think of the modern school doing to poor children. You decide you're going to give your child a puppy for Christmas, right? Great idea. What would you do if you're going to give your child a puppy? This is how I would do it. If I'm going to give my children a puppy for Christmas, I would get a kind of a cage that has air. You know, it wouldn't be too tight on the wires. The dog needs to breathe. And then, because I'm mischievous, I would wrap the cage in tissue paper or something that you can breeze through, but you don't know what's inside it, right? And then around 3 or 4 in the morning, I would get up no, that's never happened, but I would get up and I would put the puppy in the cage, wrap it all up, and then around 5:30 or 6 o'clock, my little kid gets up because it's Christmas morning, and they come running down the stairs, and there's this noise going on, right? It sounds like a puppy, it smells like a puppy, but you're never sure, right? You're never sure until you see it. So eventually, he's going to unwrap it, and there's that puppy, and it's going to lick his face, and they're going to do all kinds of disgusting things that kids do with dogs, and I'm just going to get sick and go eat lunch or something. But my child will have a living puppy, and then he'll play with it. Okay, but this is what we do. We take the puppy, and we put a collar on it, and we attach it to the leash. We take it out in the backyard, and we run it over with the lawnmower. And then we pick up the limbs off the ground, and we put them in a box, and we hand the kid, we wrap it up, put a bow on it, right? We put flashing lights all around it, and since we know they're not going to like what's in it, we're going to make it especially fancy wrapping paper, and we do everything we can to get them excited, and then they open up the gift, and they get grossed out, and we say, "What? I love dogs! Why don't you like this?" "'Cause it's dead, Mom." Or Dad. No mom would do that. But that's what we do. That's what we do. We run our truths over with the lawnmower, and we give them to them dead, and we can't figure out why their souls aren't moved by it. We literally cut it up. We analyze it. And what we need to be doing if we want our children to love the truth is to let them experience it. Teach them how to see it. They'll love it. Unless it personally is a risk or a threat to them, they'll love it. By nature, children love dogs and truths. And I like watermelon. See, if we wrap up the gift, if we wrap up the puppy and then they can unwrap it, then we're waiting upon Pentecost. Then there's this moment of revelation. And the cloven tongues of fire descend upon that child, pretty predictably, actually. But notice what her language says again. There is something about educational syllabuses. This is written by Dorothy Sayers during World War II. I believe it's 1941. There's something about educational syllabuses, and especially about examination papers, which seems, she's so polite, you know, this British politeness, which seems to be rather out of harmony with Pentecostal manifestations. We Americans would say that has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with, because that would be more accurate. Out of harmony with Pentecostal manifestations. She's using this language analogically. She's not talking right here about the full realization of Pentecost on Acts 2 and how we are given the Holy Spirit. What she's doing is drawing an analogy. She's saying that in the normal modes of thinking, that the way we are designed, the way we are created, when our souls embrace truth, there's a little miniature Pentecost that takes place. And the Spirit, because remember, He's the Spirit of truth. He loves all truth. He will always bring joy with that truth if we allow Him to. He is an energy, you might even say. When we perceive the truth, it is as though the cloven tongues of fire have descended upon us. Not in the full glory of Acts 2, you understand that, but a hint, a taste of that. Which, by the way, we educators are terrified of because, man, does it disturb the classroom. It's so unpredictable. How do you measure it? Well, I have some really good news for you. Of the 3 things that you can teach, 1/3 of it can be accurately measured. You can measure how well they recall information you communicate to them. I have really more good news, but it might be taken as bad news. What matters most cannot be measured. Because the reason you teach information to the child, the reason you teach skills to the child, is so that they can combine information with skills and see truth. And you cannot measure the degree of perception of a child by, how do you say this? You cannot measure the degree to which a child perceives a given truth. Unless you know that truth yourself, and you know that child well enough, and you know what to look for. And so if you know math, if you actually can perceive, my thing today is the distributive property. I tried to figure that out over the weekend, so that's why. If you perceive the distributive property yourself and you feel the power of it and you can see all the things that it can make you able to do, then you will be able to see when a child has it. But you won't be able to know whether a child has it if you don't. And you won't if all you can do is repeat the formula. A times B plus C equals AB plus AC, right? Is that right? There, I said it. Everybody gets it now, right? Good, thank you. The way we teach is out of harmony with Pentecostal manifestations. You see? Do you see what she's getting at? The joy of seeing the truth that brings an energy into the soul is not experienced because of the way we teach too often. She goes on and says, the energy of ideas does not seem to descend. Notice the word energy. The energy of ideas. Do you understand that ideas have energy? It is as if ideas have a life of their own. Sometimes I think they do. I can see why some people are pagans, because ideas have so much power that you feel like some person has come alongside and multiplied your energy. The energy of ideas, oh yeah, it has happened. The spirit of truth, right. Okay. The energy of ideas does not seem to descend into the receptive mind with quite that rush of cloven fire which we ought to expect. Do you expect that? It's kind of a challenge to us. Do you expect an energy to flow into a receptive mind? That's what she says we ought to expect. And then she talks about maybe there's something wrong with our idea of education. I think she's on to something there. And then she says possibly something inhibiting has happened to the energy. Maybe something is blocking the energy of the truth as it's trying to enter your child's soul. Well, if that's the case, we need to figure it out, don't we? We need to find out what it is. We need to remove the inhibition to the extent that we're able to do so. And then she makes this very cautionary, is that the word? Very cautionary expression. She says, but Pentecost will happen. There will be an idea that will enter into your student's soul, that will enter into your child's soul. There will be some idea that will enter into his soul. And when it happens, he will be energized by it, and he will be willing to give up his life for it. It's going to happen. It might be the idea of a girl, of taking possession of some girl. It might be the idea, well, the 2 that she listed are Nietzsche and Marx. It might be the nihilism of Nietzsche. It might be Marxism, the childishness of Marxism. It might be the Frankfurt School of Marxism, genetic determinism. It might be racism or sexism, or what's the other one? I guess sexual orientation. Those are the 3 substitutes for class now that nobody cares about class anymore. There's going to be some idea that's going to get into your child's soul, that's going to get into your student's soul, and when that happens, it will be a counterfeit Pentecost. It will be, you might even say, To quote Nietzsche in regard to himself, it might even be the work of Antichrist. From some quarter or other, the power will descend, to flame or to smolder until it is ready to issue in a new revelation. And then she says, we need not suppose that because the mind of the reader is inert to Plato. See, a child might have no receptiveness to what Plato's got to say. Or we might have cut up Plato. We might have outlined every chapter so that the child doesn't have to. We might have defined every term so that the child doesn't have to think about them. We might have made it easy so that the child doesn't have to struggle to perceive what he wants to perceive, and thereby made it impossible for him to wrestle with his puppy. We might have taken away the opportunity from our children to see the truth of Plato. Well, okay, then Plato will be inert to them. But that doesn't mean that he'll be inert to Nietzsche or Karl Marx. Failing those, it may respond to Danielle Steele or to Hollywood. That's where we've got, isn't it? I mean, if you go to college nowadays, you know how religion is the opiate of the masses. Marxism is the opiate of the elite. So if you go to college nowadays, you go and snort your Marx and become rapidly addicted. But if you don't, you just watch a lot of movies. And then she makes this incredibly important statement, which is really the whole point of the paragraph. No incarnate idea is altogether devoid of power. That's good news and bad news. No incarnate idea is altogether devoid of power. If, therefore, you want to teach with power, if you want to teach in a way that communicates truth to the very soul of your student, and their soul, if it's receptive, welcomes it in, and they have these mini Pentecosts. We call them aha moments. We call them epiphanies. We call them a lot of things. Joy. If we want to see our children experience that, then we need to give our children their puppies in a way that they can play with them. We need to make sure that the idea is incarnate. You see, what's been difficult for you probably about this whole session so far is how little I've incarnated the idea and how much I've abstracted it. I'm using all these big words, and I have to, she uses them. But I'm using this technical analytical language. But I'm going to guess that when I used the dog metaphor, that grossed you out enough that some of you even woke up from your naps. Because what was I doing? I was trying to take an idea and I was trying to incarnate it. And maybe, she goes on to say, if the idea is feeble, maybe this whole talk is about a feeble idea, I don't know. If the energy is dispersed, you know how I am, I disperse my energies all over the place. And if the power is dim, if there's really not much of a communication of the power in the idea, well, then the indwelling spirit will be dim, dispersed, and feeble. Okay? This is a very good way to assess your lessons when you're teaching kids. You're looking for standards for self-assessment as a teacher, there they are. Is the idea feeble? Is the energy dispersed? And is the power dim? If so, you've taught badly. But such as it is, so its response will be. And such will be its manifestation in the world. Our duty as teachers, our duty is to take the truth that we want our children to perceive, whether it be a historical truth like succession is difficult, or whether it be a mathematical truth like the distributive property, or like point is that which has no part, or whether it be a metaphysical truth like things are what they are, or whether it be a theological truth like there is one God in three persons. Whatever kind of truth you're trying to teach, if you can teach it, if in your own mind it is a powerful idea, if it has power in your own mind, and if you can take the energy of that idea and focus it and concentrate it like a laser and direct it into the soul of your student, and if the power releases that energy in their soul, then you are effectively teaching. If you can take an idea and incarnate it in a way that their soul can absorb it, can embrace it, then you're an effective teacher. And if you can't, it doesn't matter how your children do on the tests. It doesn't matter how much information they can regurgitate for you. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is whether their soul is transformed by the truth that you're teaching them. And so Dorothy Sayers has given us 3 key elements of teaching: the idea, the energy, and the power. And what she argues is that the idea is like the Father. That the energy, and I actually prefer a different word for the energy. I would personally apply the energy to the Spirit, but she applies energy to the Son. But in one place she says the activity, the work itself. And this is what she means. The idea, the truth that you're trying to teach, it's eternal. Isn't that amazing? That you, with your finite mind and feeble soul, can see eternal truth? Here, just think about that for a moment. We'll have a moment of silence to just enjoy that. You are capable of seeing eternal truth. Not only are you capable of seeing it, you are capable of teaching it, of revealing it, of communicating it to another person. Now, the truth is the Father, is the unchanging, eternal idea, okay? The Son is the activity by which the truth is revealed. The Son gives flesh and blood to the truth. And that's what we get to do as teachers. We get to take this truth, this idea, this energetic power that we want our students to perceive, and we can imitate God formally by giving it flesh and blood. We can come up with a parable, we can come up with an example, we can come up with an illustration, but we can present the truth to the child the way Nathan did to David, like we talked about earlier, but we can present the truth to a child, and they can see things beyond what their senses can perceive. They can see eternal truths. So that's the Son, is the activity, the incarnate portion of it. And then third comes the power. She calls the Holy Spirit the power. And if we absorb well into our own soul the truth that we're thinking about, that we want to communicate to others, if we have it in our soul, if it has changed us, and then we come up with effective ways to embody it for our students, it will have power. It will enter into the circumstances and it will change things. Now, this is an analogy of teaching. This is an analogy, but it's also a description of it. When we teach, what we're trying to do is communicate truth to the soul of the student. I love the way Bob Ingram once put it down in Florida. He said the task, the effective teacher, I forgot the beginning, but something about the teacher, the task of the teacher, is the overflow of his soul into the life of his student. Okay, maybe the quality or the excellence of the teacher, or what the teacher's trying to do. Right? The great lesson, the great teaching is the overflow of his soul into the life of his student. Do you see how you can't just prepare a lesson plan to make that happen? You actually have to embrace into your soul the truth. And then you have to come up with ways to reincarnate, forgive me, to reincarnate that truth, to incarnate that truth in a way that transfers it from your soul to another. One of the most amazing thoughts we could ever have is precisely that I love to think about Adam naming the animals, for example, and I get carried away sometimes, and I forget that Eve wasn't there yet. In fact, that's the whole point of the story. So when I tell this story, I imagine that Adam sees this animal, wrestles with it and plays with it and stuff, and then Eve and Adam sit down beside a river and talk about it. Have you ever thought about the astonishing truth that you and your spouse can sit and talk about what's in your souls? Parrots can't. Animals can communicate what they perceive with their senses, but they can't communicate what's in their souls. They don't have family histories. They don't have traditions. They don't have liturgies and rituals. They don't eat round the table and, have their. They don't sanctify the meal with the Word of God and prayer. They don't do any of that stuff. But we can. We can sit in the presence of another eternal being, and we can listen while something in their soul is transferred over to us. That's what we're doing when we're teaching. Or at least when we're teaching with power, that's what we're doing. No incarnate idea is altogether devoid of power. So take the ideas that you want to communicate and do everything in your power to empower them, to make them full of power. And that, generally speaking, requires two things. It requires that you in your own experience, that you yourself have embraced, have received, have been changed, have been expanded, have been enlarged by the truth that you received. And let me say again, this sounds on the one hand like all I'm talking about is Bible study or knowing God. I'm talking about math, I'm talking about history, I'm talking about phonemes. Every truth is truth. Every truth is wonderful, transformative, and beautiful. All truth is God's truth. I think it was Schaeffer used to like saying that. All truth is God's truth. Doesn't mean all of them are pleasant, but all truth is life-giving if received in the right way. So the two things we need to do, the first thing is we need to grasp. In fact, that's a pretty good word, isn't it? Grasp. We need to apprehend. Apprehend, that's Latin for take hold of. We need to take hold of the truth with our soul. And then, being changed by it and understanding it, gaining the delight that it brings by its very nature into our lives, then we can find ways to re-embody that truth in a way that meets our students at their level of capacity, at their level of experience, at their level of life. Now, you can teach a fable to a kindergarten child because the law of God, the counsel of God, the wisdom of God is written in their hearts. You can teach a 5-year-old very abstract things, moral principles and so on, through fables. Why? Because a fable is the incarnation of a truth. And Aesop's in particular, Luther, for example, advocated spending years and years on Aesop's fables because he recognized that these were very powerful tools, very powerful embodiments of deep truths, and they were inexhaustible. And you can take a simple story like that, and you can think about it with a 5-year-old child and be astounded by some of their insights. However, they're still only 5. And when they're 8, they'll see more. And when they're 11, they'll see more still. And when they're 17, they'll see a lot more. And you hope that after that, they will continue to see more. And what will happen is, because they've got this fable, this story, this image, this parable, this myth, this folk tale, whatever it happens to be, that embodies quite a few truths actually in literature, because they have the story deeply planted in their soul, and because they're constantly revolving around it and thinking about it, for the rest of their lives, that story will shed light on every other story that they ever read. And they will begin to weave in their own souls a tapestry of learning, a tapestry of wisdom. And they will see how things fit together. They will see that, in fact, this world is one. And I want to transition here to the kind of some practical applications of this notion of weaving. Because you see, in our world, in our day and age, we've come unraveled. We don't have any principles of order in our society. We don't have anything that holds us together. For 1,000 years, European civilization was formally bound by notions of the Holy Trinity and the incarnate Son. Now, were they perfect Christians? Of course not. But it's amazing, especially when you compare a society like ours with theirs. And you see the extent and the dimensions of their whole society being influenced by the form of Christ. We don't have that anymore. We don't have any common theme. We don't have a thread that holds this tapestry together. So I want to take a moment, if I may here, and describe for you a couple things about weaving, and then I want to use that as an analogy to talk about, if we have time, 3 things. I want to talk about 4 threads of school experience, and I want to talk about 4 elements of school community and how we need to weave those things together. And then for fun, if we have time, I want to talk about 4 kinds of weaving in the Odyssey. I like the Odyssey. But here's the basic point. This is the single idea that I'm just trying to rotate around and around in my own mind and with you. Weaving is an essential analogy for our existence. Or if you like, I can change that around and say that we need to learn how to think analogously. We have a tendency to think univocally or equivocally. We have a tendency to be either prodigal or big brotherish in our thinking. We have a tendency to think about things as they are not. We need to learn to think about things in their relations. And everything, literally everything, exists in relation to other things. There is no such thing in the cosmos. There is no such thing as an individual existence. One of the corruptions of modern thought is the loss of personhood and its replacement by the individual. And if I want to talk about that for about 2 minutes, if I may, because one of the glorious teachings of Christianity is the teaching of personhood. One of the things that we can fail to realize because we take it for granted is that the notion of personhood is an entirely Christian idea. No other religion, no other philosophy, no other society has ever had the notion of personhood. What we have now got, and we use the word person to describe it, I see this all the time in education literature, what we now have is the notion of the individual, and we mix that up with the notion of the person. Okay, we think that individual. A person is not merely an individual. A person is a one in relation. There has never been anything that wasn't in relation. This might seem like, why am I beating this point so hard? But even the Holy Trinity, even God himself, has never existed without relations. You could even go so far as to say that God is relationship. You could say that God is communion. He is the relationship of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit in a certain sense. Now, I got to tread carefully here because I don't want to become a heretic and we're talking about deep mysteries. But God himself has never existed as an individual. He is 3 persons. And that notion of him being 3 persons is something that was the product of centuries of careful thought. Because in the early church, they had all kinds of heresies coming along and schismatics that were coming along and arguing against the gospel and breaking down the unity of the God and man in Christ Jesus, of the two natures in one person. There was the one group that wanted us to be able to work for our salvation and to be able to, the older brother. And so they became the Judaizers, the legalists. And then there was another group, and they celebrated the deity of Christ. And then there was another group that wanted us to be able to they celebrated the manhood of Christ because they wanted to say that he achieved deity. Right? The Arian doctrine is that there was a time when Christ was not. That he was a created being, but he attained some kind of super status. Okay? It's sort of like the Mormon doctrine now, where you can become God by super effort. Right? There's nothing new there. And that's the idea of the manhood separate from the deity so that he could become divine. But then there's the idea that there's the deity but not the manhood. And here you get the Gnostics and teachings like that, the people who said that Jesus never really suffered. He never really suffered because that would be, that'd be shameful. Here you might hear a Muslim echo. I can remember some friends of mine who were Muslim discussing whether God could have a son. I mean, you really want to offend a Muslim, tell him that God has a son. The language that my friend Kamal used was, you're humiliating God. Now, if you're talking about the Father generating a Son the way we do, yeah, that would be totally inappropriate. He's the eternally begotten Son of the Father. There was never a time when he was not. He is begotten of the Father outside of time. When he became man, he didn't cease being God. And he himself, you could say, humiliated himself. He himself took upon himself the form of a servant. And that's intolerable to the Muslim mind. It's intolerable to the mind that has a totally transcendent God. So you get the Gnostic idea that he never suffered. He was removed from the cross. Somebody else was crucified for him. All kinds of teachings like that. Well, the fact is that Jesus was God and is God and always will be God. And he took on human flesh. And he suffered and was buried. And he took on himself all of human nature sinlessly so that he could save all of human nature. He took on himself a human will. He took on himself a human body. He took on himself human emotions, human relationships. And in one person, he took on two natures. This is intolerable apart from grace. And in so doing, not only did he save us, but he revealed the Trinity to us. And he revealed that the Trinity is three persons. Hypostasis is the Greek word. And what's interesting, the Latin word persona, from which we get person, actually originally meant mask. And there was a heresy that argued that God, I think it's called modalism, God just changes his mask from time to time. Sometimes he's the Father, sometimes he's the Son, and sometimes he's the Holy Spirit. And they had to argue and clarify all of that. No. It's not that he's wearing masks. It's that there are three persons and they are eternal. And in so arguing, and then recognizing that we are the image of God for the first time in world history, during the 4th century, Christians revealed to the human race who they were. Persons made in the image of a person. But now, because of the naturalistic, nihilistic revolution of the 17th to 20th century, we've lost that sense of personhood. And now you're either an individual or you're a member of a community. And there's all this conflict between the psychologist and the sociologist, right? There's all this constant fighting between, is it the group that makes you or is it the individual? Do you choose yourself or are you chosen? Is it predetermined? These are arguments that have been going on since long before Homer. The answer is we don't know. But what we do know is that personhood is a gift from the person of persons, and that our dignity and our nobility is lost when we stop believing in him who is three persons. We are an analogy of God. Do you see that? The whole creation is an analogy of God, but we are his image and his likeness. We are an analogy of God himself. That is why we are persons. And that is why we cannot be known and understood, and we cannot know and understand ourselves apart from a right knowledge of God. As John Calvin put it in the very first sentence of the Institutes. Can't remember it exactly, but it's basically, he says, all true knowledge is either knowledge of God or knowledge of self, and they each depend on the other. Does anybody remember the exact wording? Okay, well, maybe it's in Westminster, but it's something that the knowledge of God and knowledge of ourselves is absolutely intertwined. If you get either of them wrong, you get both of them wrong. Why? Because we're an image. So, to come back, so what I'm wanting to encourage here, what I'm wanting to encourage you to do is to embrace the analogical nature of the world in which we live. And understand that we can only gain true personal knowledge through analogies, through likenesses. And we can only teach effectively through analogy and through likenesses. Parables, fables, metaphors, and so on. I like to use the word types. In the Old Testament, we have type after type after type of Christ, right? Do you remember John the Baptist sees Jesus walking along the sea? I love to tell this story because of something that happened to me when I was about 9th grade. I was a Awana leader, and I had 3rd grade kids in our little tribe time, I think it was called. And one of the kids memorized this verse, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So he said it to me, he recited it, and I said, "So why do you think John the Baptist called him the Lamb of God?" I will never forget this. Well, maybe I will when I go senile, but for 2 or 3 more years, I won't forget this. Why do you think, I said, he called Jesus the Lamb of God? And this little boy says, "Because he was so cute." Isn't that a cute answer? And it is in a 3rd grader's mouth. But imagine if an adult actually thought that. Why did that child think that? Because up until that point in life, lambs were stuffed animals or, cute little, he obviously wasn't a farmer. Another thing he obviously wasn't was a Jew in the Old Testament. Because lambs, they can be cute if you wash them every 5 minutes. But lambs mainly are used for slaughtering, for sacrificing, for atonement. The disciples of John knew this. And when John said, "Behold," I love that word, behold. Have I mentioned that? Behold, that's what we need to be doing, and that's what we need to be teaching our children to do, is to behold. He said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And none of them thought, "Oh, he's really cute." What they realized, what they could perceive, was that he is going to be sacrificed. Or maybe, let me even rephrase that, because there might have been a cognitive dissonance. I don't know what that means, but my wife used the phrase a couple weeks ago. I thought it was really cool. I think it means something about confusion. They may have been confused. Wait a minute. What are you telling us? This is the Lamb of God. What are we supposed to do with that? So at the very least, he was raising an important question in their minds. And maybe 1 or 2 of them was so insightful that they understood, okay, this one's going to end up being sacrificed. Certainly John held on to the phrase, because a long time later, when he wrote his gospel sitting in a home in Ephesus, he mentioned it. "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." For 1,500 years, every morning and every evening, they were sacrificing lambs in the tabernacle. Every year on the Day of Atonement, if my memory is correct, every year on the Day of Atonement, they came and they would have to bring a lamb or maybe a turtle dove or something, and it would be slaughtered. These were types. The whole Old Testament is about Jesus. It's one type after another. You look at the tabernacle. One of my favorite types is in Leviticus Chapter 2. Leviticus Chapter 2. It's one of the first sacrifices mentioned. "When anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it." Anybody here ever smell frankincense? It's an amazing smell. You guys ever do like incense when you take a bath or something? Very spiritual. When anyone offers I thought everybody in California does stuff like that. "When anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, oil poured on it, and frankincense." All right. "And he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, one of whom shall take from it his handful of fine flour and oil with all the frankincense. And the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord." Does anybody know what the biblical image of incense represents? In Revelation, it makes it very explicit. The burning of incense is a picture for prayer, the prayers of the saints. If we want to know how much God cherishes us, we've got to read this stuff in the tabernacle. Here's what our Lord thinks of prayer. It is a memorial. He will burn it as a memorial on the altar. He takes our prayers as a memorial. Second, he takes it as an offering made by fire. Now you all know, how incredibly easy it is to be always praying with a sincere and pure heart, right? You know what prayer is from us? It's an offering by fire. It's hard to pray. He knows that. But the third thing prayer is to him is a sweet aroma to the Lord. Next time you're praying and you're feeling totally unworthy and you're feeling like you can't pray, maybe add a request. Lord, take this smelly, rotten flower and turn it into a sweet aroma. Because he will. He loves it so much when we pray that he describes it as a memorial, an offering by fire, and a sweet aroma. This is a God who knows what prayer is. This is a God who knows what it's like for us to pray and appreciates it and accepts it. This is our God. And so what he does is he gives us this type of prayer so that we can see how much he values it. Now, he could have said, pray, I really like it. Maybe that would work. Kind of abstract, though, right? But he gives us instead a picture so that we can weave it into our very souls. And so there's three movements that I want to mention about weaving, and let's see if I can do this in the time allotted. I'm going to do my honest and noble best. There are three basic movements to weaving. I got these all from Wikipedia, so if you guys know weaving, don't laugh at me too hard. There's what's called shedding, there's picking, and there's battening. In a loom, you've got the warp and the whelp, or sometimes it's called the whelf. The warp and the whelf, and sometimes the whelf is called the woof. And what it is the warp usually goes up and down, unless it's a horizontal loom, in which case it just goes across. But across isn't the word I want. It goes that way. And you can have three kinds of loom. You can have a top-down or a bottom-up, or you can have a horizontal. But you take your warp, and they're all going in one direction, and then you take your whelf, and they're going across. Okay. Now, to make that happen, and to make it work, you need to be able to lift every other thread, or linen, or whatever material you're using. Okay? And so what happens is you shed. You create a shed. That's shedding. It's not like a dog shedding, although it may be related. But what's happening is every other thread is behavior. Every other thread is being lifted. Okay, that's called shedding. And this space in here is called the shed. Okay. And then it picks. And that's where the shuttle comes across. Get through there. The shuttle comes across this way, and it just, depending on your womb, if it's a powerful one, it'll just go right across the whole way, and then it'll come back. Okay? That's called picking. There's shedding and there's picking. Now, when the shuttle comes back, you've got a problem in that everything's kind of loose, and so now you need the third movement, and that's battening. So on the pirate ship, they speak of battening down the hatch, right? That's to secure everything. Okay, don't let it be moving around. There's shedding, there's picking, and there's battening. I mentioned that there's three kinds of loom. One of my favorite Bible stories about weaving is in the book of Judges. It's, I wrote the wrong chapter. I think it's chapter 13. I wrote 6, I'm sorry. It's a Samson story. Let's see, chapter 16. Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom." It's nuts. So he's taken his hair and divided it into 7, call them warps. He's obviously warped. And Delilah apparently has one of these horizontal looms. So it's down the ground, and so there's these threads going across already, and now she takes his hair while he's napping and weaves it through this way. So the 7 locks of his hair are in this loom now. And it says, so she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom. Boy, was he dumb. And said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. I'm wondering if he woke up. I mean, the only way I can make sense of this is that he got up, and with the muscles of his neck and back, he just used his hair to rip the loom off. And by the way, it's not a small loom. You can imagine that if you've got this seven. I wonder if he was into reggae. But these 7 locks are through there, and he just rips it up. This makes me laugh. But and then of course, what does she say to him? How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? And then of course leads to his utter destruction and death. Never trust a woman. Oh, sorry. Never say that in front of a group of women. If we're going to think analogically, let me use 2 examples of how I think we can apply this to education directly. The real point, though, that I want to make is that we need to be developing the habit of constantly thinking analogically. That we need to be, every time you're thinking about anything, anytime you're trying to make a decision, compare it to something ludicrous. Right? Because any 2 things can be compared. I once said this, I was teaching the Iliad to a group of kids, and I said you can compare any 2 things. And one kid says, I don't believe you, Mr. Kern. And I said, okay, tell me 2 things you can't compare. And he said, Achilles and a carpet. So I said to the class, okay, tell me, anybody, how is Achilles like a carpet? And Matthew Burnett, who deserves immortality for saying this, raises his head. He says, I know, Mr. Kern. And I said, Matthew, how is Achilles like a carpet? And he says, Agamemnon walked on both of them. You see, the more different things are, the more fruitful the comparison. I mean, how much is the kingdom of heaven actually like a mustard seed? Do you see how that enlarges your mind just thinking about it? The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Aristotle said that the true mark of genius is to find similarities among incredibly different things. So we can train our students in being geniuses by finding these similarities. So when you're thinking about any decision, take the terms of your decision, try to specify it, say whether so-and-so should do such and such, and then try to define those terms, and then ask yourself, if my question is whether Achilles should have killed, Hector, then let's define Hector and let's compare Hector to anything we can compare Hector to. Do you notice that all of a sudden the whole universe is your curriculum and you can think about Hector forever? Makes the curriculum a lot easier. One fable for 12 years. But now let me bring it into school experience. I want to think about school experiences as a weaving. And the reason I want to do that is because we live in the industrial age where the habit of our mind, where the metaphors we live by are inadequate to the world we live in. We tend to think industrially, whether we're thinking about industry or not. We tend to think about production and about measurement and about factories, even if we're thinking about things that are unrelated to all those things, because that's so much the habit of our culture. Now, we're still human. And because we're still human, we can't limit ourselves to that. And so we continually draw back to analogies and metaphors because that's the only way we can learn. But when we think professionally about things, and when we think about education formally, the tendency is to be governed by the metaphors of industry. And so, for example, when we think of governance, we'll because the IRS requires it, we'll form a board. And that board will then put in place a vision and a mission and a strategy, and we'll do all the sorts of things that the military developed and then put into industry in our military industrial complex. And we will think in terms of measurable results given in these different domains. And that's okay as long as we're willing to laugh at ourselves. But if we take it seriously, we will not be able to do what we're trying to do. That was an extreme way of putting it. I was kind of being facetious. It's okay in its limited domain is what I mean. There is a place for measurement. There is a place for let's call it industrial analytical thought. There's a place for it. But it doesn't lead us all the way to wisdom. I don't know if we can get to wisdom without it. Probably not. But it doesn't take us to wisdom. So let me explain what I mean in terms of school. I want to talk first about the elements of a school community, because I actually believe this is where a lot of crisis is taking place. And I think I might have something possibly helpful for any of you that might want to weave a tighter community in your schools. There are basically 4 elements in a school community. 5 if we count the students, but for what I'm going to talk about, I hope you'll forgive me, the students really don't matter. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm going to put the students aside for this analogy. There are 4 elements of a school community. There's the board, there's the administrative team, there's the teachers, and there's the parents. Now, in the last couple of months, I've asked a number of different people, how much time do those 4 elements of your community spend in the same room? And this is the answer I've got almost every time. Well, are we counting graduation? One person told me the only time that those 4 elements of the community were in the same room at the same time was at graduation. Another told me that they added the kickoff in the fall. Now, how much of a community can you have when the membership of the community is in the same room for an hour or 2 or 3 a year? And what I want to propose to you is that as we build our schools, one of the most important, most pressing needs we have is to have a community of one-mindedness. I think of 1 Corinthians 1:10, where Paul entreats the Corinthians to be of one mind and of one judgment. What are the mechanisms that we have? Where is the loom that we use to weave ourselves into one mind and one judgment? What I'm finding is this, that almost every school, when I talk to them about this, almost every school has a board thread running parallel to an administrative thread with one link, usually the headmaster, running parallel to the teacher thread, running parallel to the parent thread, which is a few spaces over on the loom. Okay, now if this, I'm hoping this is totally irrelevant to you. But if this means anything, if this speaks to you at all, I want to propose to you that this is bad. That we're not building the healthy and strong communities that we need to. We have the warp, and so we're warped, but we don't have the weft. We don't have the shuttle. And so I've been thinking an awful lot lately about what can we do? What ideas can we introduce to schools that might help with this? What loom can we create for this? And the idea that we're starting to experiment with in the Circe Institute, actually, I hope you'll forgive me for this, but I'm modifying this from a charter school. How to get yourself in trouble with a private classical school. I went to visit a charter school. And they had this really good idea. They called it the classical core, co-op, the classical co-op. I've modified this, and I'm beginning to put together this idea that I call the classical core fellowship, the classical core fellowship. And this is what I mean. This is what I'm thinking we need to have happen. First of all, we need fellowship. We will not be able to build a community without fellowship. And we need fellowship across the threads. Okay. Second, we need a fellowship that revolves around, or I'll say it this way now, to mix up my metaphors. We need a fellowship that is energized by the core. And this is what I mean by the core. It's an analogy with the sun. The sun has basically 2 parts to it, the surface and the core. And what we see of the sun is, it's light here mostly, but what we experience of the sun is what is radiated off the surface. We get the light and the energy that is radiated off the surface of the sun. But here's what's interesting. So far as I know, none of the energy that comes from the sun comes from the surface of the sun. All of it comes from the core. And in the core of the sun is this incredible density of of atoms and elements that are perpetually, constantly exploding as nuclear explosions. It's a mega atomic bomb. And the energy, when an atom explodes, or whatever you call it, when an atom explodes in the core, the energy then that is released starts working its way out to the surface. As I understand it, it takes a long time, thousands of years, for that energy to work from the core to the surface. I have to go read my articles again to get the details right, but in fact, therefore, I'll quit using so many of them. The point is, there's this core where the energy is generated, and then the energy works its way to the surface and radiates out into the solar system. And that's what we live off of, is the energy that comes from the core. Now, one of the realities of life is that without energy, work doesn't get done. And if you consume all the energy, there comes a point where there's no point even trying to work. And my big question for schools is, where are the teachers getting their energy? Where are the parents getting their energy? It's kind of like the Dorothy Sayers point, that there will be a release of energy. It's going to come from somewhere. But what are we doing to generate the energy that keeps the life of the school going, that keeps the solar flares, that keeps the heat of the sun shining on the planets in our solar system? That's why we call it a classical core fellowship, because the purpose of it is primarily to be an experience of classical education for the whole school in a way that generates the energy that will be needed to sustain the life of the school. I call it classical because I'm hoping that it'll be classical. And this is what I'm imagining, and it's all experimental at this point, or hypothetical rather. But what I'm imagining is this. You take, let's say, 3 people from the board, and 3 people from the administration, and 3 people that are teachers, and 3 parents. And you put them in a room together. Let's just say once a month. Nobody can afford more than that. For 90 minutes. And during that 90 minutes, all they do is think about something that isn't practical. Right? Because boards, they're always dealing with practical things. Okay, you come to a board meeting and you bring your petition, or maybe they have, what do? They make decisions. That's what they're supposed to do. They make decisions. Where's the wisdom coming from for those decisions? Where are the ideas coming from? Where's the energy being generated for these boards to make their decisions? What I'm suggesting is that by having 3 board members on this core, they will be interacting with teachers, administration, and parents. And when they go back to the board meeting and think about things, there will be a much deeper connection with the life of the school, a much closer apprehension of the heartbeat of the school, and B, an energy that will make any advice that they receive from this core useful. I think it'll add an efficiency to board meetings. Any board that's meeting for 4 or 5 hours a month is meeting way too long and needs to spend more time just thinking, just enjoying the Odyssey or something, because they need the energy and they need the clarity. But if we're always dealing with practical things, see, practical things consume energy. They tend not to create it. That's why I haven't given you as much practical. I'm just trying to help you get some energy, so I'm being useless. Now imagine, but I don't see this classical core fellowship having any authority over the board. I don't think that would be appropriate. But I do see them advising the board. Now imagine there's 3 parents on this. One of the biggest crises in classical education that's been going on for about 15 years now is succession. The number 1 lesson that history teaches, succession is difficult. The number 1 lesson of school governance, succession is difficult. I could list off one after another school that I've worked with or that I've witnessed that have had a good board in place and they rotated off. The new board wasn't prepared and equipped, didn't really understand it, came up with brilliant ideas, marvelous marketing program, reduced everything to measurement, and pretty soon the school was fragmented and dying because their management principles were so effective if you're a Fortune 500 company. But they didn't fit the nature of school. Where's the succession? Where are the next board members coming from? One of the benefits of a classical core fellowship would be that you get parents in this fellowship, and after 3 years, they've got it, they understand it, they know what's going on. So I won't belabor this point except to say this is how the tapestry metaphor can help us think about things. This is how we can weave together a community. By taking the elements, by recognizing that we tend to think in isolated threads, don't we? And we need to learn to think in terms of the weft that brings them together and the batten that tightens the hatches, that tightens up the tapestry. The hardest thing about weaving, from what I've been able to, I don't know this by experience, but from what I've been able to read, the real expert in weaving is the person who can weave a design into it. Right? To put a face into a tapestry. I can see how they do it with mosaics. If you're going to do a checkerboard pattern, that would even be hard to do. You have to let the thread go only so far, and then you got to put in a new thread. I don't know how they do that. But what if you're actually going to put a face into a tapestry? This takes a degree of expertise. This takes a degree of wisdom. This is what Homer was talking about when he described the Phaeacian women as having received from Athena, the goddess of design. See that? The goddess of wisdom, the goddess of design. They received from Athena good character, and really the word might well be cunning, but craftsmanship. They were skilled at weaving designs. We could look at school experience, the 4 threads of school experience. We kind of just touched on it, but now this is more for you as teachers perhaps, but the 4 threads of the experience, the academic experience would be, I'll say 3 threads. I'll take governance out. I did have that in. But curriculum, teaching, and assessment. You have to have something to teach, you have to have a mode of teaching, and you have to have a way of assessing it. What do you do when those 3 separate threads are working in different tapestries or developing different designs? I would argue, we're doing our conference theme this year at Circe in Baltimore is on judgment. And the reason we're doing that is because for the last 3 years or so, folks like Christopher Perrin and Lee Bortons and myself and Andrew Pudewa and a number of other people have been, Martin Cawthron, we've been gathering together and trying to figure out what is an appropriate way to assess. If we're not just trying to get high SAT scores, what is an appropriate way to assess? How can we assess students' work in a way that doesn't just make them anxious, distracted, and careful about many things? How can we do that? So we're going to spend our whole conference, 2.5 days, just thinking about judgment as a concept and then applying it to assessment. But one of the things we've got to be able to do is take curriculum, teaching, and assessment and not just line them up in 3 straight lines that are pretty. We need to have principles that come across as the weft and weave them together into a tapestry where they're one-minded, where they're the same picture, the same design. Because if we don't do that, if we're assessing in inappropriate ways, we might still be able to teach effectively, but every time we assess, we'll undercut the teaching. Is that what we want to do? And I think that's exactly what's happening to so many of our schools. We're using industrial modes of assessment that were designed either by the Prussian military or by the factories and scientific management theory, which they don't even use in factories anymore. And here we are using them in schools to see how well students are performing in relation to each other, which is the least valuable piece of information you could possibly ever get about a student. The most distracting thing you could ever learn about a student is how he's doing in relation to other students. What we need to learn how to do is we need to have a curriculum and a mode of teaching and an assessment, a mode of assessment that all speak the same language, that all move to the same end, that are all weaving the same picture. And if you like, the analogy I would draw here is that we need principles, we need elements, and we need forms that cross the curriculum, teaching, and assessment that apply to all 3. We need principles that apply to all 3. We need elements that apply to all 3. We need forms that are consistent across the 3. And then we can weave some magnificent fine linen, like what was needed for the curtains in the temple, like what was needed for the priests. One of the things that's fascinating about the priests' garments is they were not allowed to weave linen and wool. This is one thing, if you read these atheist websites, they love to laugh at us about this. I suppose you're wearing mixed fabric on your jackets. I guess that's really deep or something. I guess I'm supposed to be really upset that I have polyester woven in with my wool here. There was a point to it. And I think, so far as I can tell, the point is that linen is made out of organic crops, like cotton, and wool is made out of animals. And he didn't want that done among the Israelites. He didn't want them weaving those things together, separating the clean from the unclean, that sort of thing. Well, that's a fascinating analogy. But we get to weave fine linen. And if we can learn to think skillfully with analogies, you know what will happen? We'll all become poets, makers, creators. Because that's what the Greek word poet actually means. Creator, maker. We will become not industrial strength factories where we can get a 7-year-old kid operating 6 looms all at once for the sake of efficiency. By the way, efficiency and education don't go together. But we can learn to weave the glorious fabric that our Lord is talking about in this amazing passage from Matthew chapter 6. He says, "Why do you worry about clothing?" By the way, who is the first person ever to worry about clothing? Eve, right? He had just talked about food. Who was the first person ever to worry about food? Yeah, I think he's got some thing going on here between the garden and... But anyway, why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. I always wondered what on earth he's talking about. Literally, I'm 49. I just figured out this week why he said spin. I always thought lilies, they don't go like this as they're growing. And I never thought about it, I'm embarrassed to say. What he's saying, they don't toil or spin. They don't have distaff and spindle. They aren't making thread. They neither toil nor spin, and yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Now if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? What college shall I go to? Which really is, what shall I eat, or what shall I drink, or what shall I wear? For after all these things the Gentiles seek. For your heavenly Father knows that you have need of all these things. It's not that they don't matter. It's not that he doesn't care. Remember Martha's opening words? Lord, do you not care? And of course, then the answer was no. But here the answer is yes, he does know. Your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these things will be added to you. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Here it says, sufficient for the day is its own trouble. We got enough to worry about today, right? Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Our Lord is the one weaving this tapestry. And he's weaving something so beautiful. And he's woven us into it. More than anything, my appeal is, let's enjoy it. God bless you. Thank you so much. We have 2 minutes. Any questions? Minute and a half. And any questions or comments anybody wanted to? Sure. Liz is saying, please don't. Well, all right then. Thank you. God bless you.